Okay, good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you attending this press seminar here at the Press Club in Brussels or via our conference call facility. My contribution to this seminar will be limited to saying farewell to all of you. Today is my last day as Director of Market Analysis and Economic Studies at EUROFER, and as of tomorrow, I will retire. After more than 40 years in the steel sector. So I must say I've had great satisfaction in taking up the challenges given to me over those years, and I appreciate having had the opportunity to exchange our insight on the European steel market with you in these seminars. With my successor, Alessandro Sciamarelli, picking up the baton, I'm convinced that the department will be in very good hands and best positioned to continue to support EUROFER and its members in the best possible way. So, Alessandro, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeroen, for your very nice introduction, for your words. And good morning, everyone. I'm Alessandro Sciamarelli, and I will take over in the position of Director of Economic Analysis at EUROFER from tomorrow onwards. So today I will be presenting the latest data on the steel market in the EU up to the third quarter of 2019, with also some key issues, some key messages for the outlook for the next 2 years, 2020 and 2021. So to get started, we'll first have a look at the the macroeconomic picture, the economic outlook, which continues to be quite uncertain also in Q3, and also according to the latest leading indicators available for Q4. This uncertainty is likely to continue, and we expect no short-term substantial improvement as I said, in the short term. We have a look here in this slide at the latest data available in relation to some confidence leading indicators for the overall economy and consumer confidence, confidence in services, and industrial confidence. And as you can see, we've had a downward trend, a clear downward trend in the EU economic sentiment since the second half of 2018. Which has, however, shown some stabilization and some short-term signs of a slight improvement in the last 2 months. But it is not clear whether this trend will change, will continue, and we will have positive economic confidence over the next months. Consumer confidence and sector confidence, on the other hand, have been quite stable in recent months and stabilizing at rather high levels in historical terms. While industrial confidence has undergone a totally different trend with a continued fall since the first half of 2018, after the peak of a previous industrial cycle, coupled with very good macroeconomic conditions. Overall, as I said, the EU economy at the end of 2019 is still heavily affected and hampered by persistent trade tensions and slowing global growth, weak manufacturing output and activity, which are hurting particularly Germany, which is the largest EU economy, but is also a largely export-oriented economy and the largest manufacturing economy in the EU. On the left-hand side, you see, respectively, the global volume of world trade, year-on-year changes that have been declining constantly since 2018, and also the volume on industrial production for major economic areas, world advanced economies and emerging economies, has also been going down since 2018, together with the slowdown of the overall economic cycle. Then last chart, it relates to industrial production in the EU and major European economies, with Germany recording slumps in industrial production year-on-year in the last 3 quarters. France being the only exception in this picture, with some moderate growth in industrial production, but all the other major industrial economies have recorded falls in industrial production. In a nutshell, GDP growth in Q3 has recorded very moderate growth. 0.3% quarter-on-quarter, 1.4% year-on-year, driven primarily by private consumption and services, which have replaced exports as a major engine of growth for the European economy as a whole. As I said, manufacturing has been experiences a rather pronounced downturn, which has hit Germany in particular, and also the slowdown in world trade has hampered exports growth, and also the downturn in the automotive sector in particular has heavily affected economic output all across Europe. The business sentiment in general, as we have seen in the previous slides, continues to be hampered by trade war worries, which are still ongoing despite some recent improvement thanks to the recent US-China trade agreement signed on the 15th of January, and ongoing Brexit-related uncertainty despite the recent victory at the elections, which have then triggered the exit of the United Kingdom from the EU. But then the deal is still to be negotiated by the end of this year, so the uncertainty is still there, and this obviously has an impact on business investment. And as a result, GDP growth for 2019 is forecast at 1.3%. Compared to 2% in 2018, so it's a considerable slowdown. It's the lowest growth rate for the economy since 2013. The outlook for the next 2 years, 2020 and 2021, is not likely to change significantly. Most recent indicators signal weak economic growth. The key driver will remain private consumption and services, which have proven quite resilient. The slowdown in international trade is likely to continue, albeit easing, as I said, so trade tensions are expected to ease somewhat. Also thanks to the US and China trade agreement that has been signed recently. On the other hand, the investment outlook remains very weak, and also in terms of potential tools that economic policy will be able to use, there is limited room for maneuver. Monetary policy has almost run out of all its potentially effective tools, has unleashed almost at its full potential its tools with interest rates remaining at zero levels, the key interest rate, and deposit rates at negative levels. So there is no room for further expansionary monetary policy. On the other hand, fiscal policy can be used to support economic growth, as public finances have improved substantially in many member states, which leaves more room for public spending, particularly in public construction. On the other hand, manufacturing is expected to continue to undergo substantial weakness throughout, at least until for the first half of 2020, with some improvement, which will not be visible before the second half of 2020. As a result, GDP growth is expected to grow by 1.2% in 2020, slightly lower than in 2019, and by 1.4% in 2021. And then we come to an overview of the major steel using sectors, namely automotive, construction, and mechanical engineering. That are the major industrial sectors that are steel users. This is a snapshot of the overall picture of industry orders and export orders for the whole industry, and also for individual steel using sectors, namely metal goods, motor vehicles, mechanical engineering, and residential buildings. As you can see, the picture remains quite gloomy in terms of export orders that have continued to go down significantly since the first half of 2018. On the other hand, stocks have continued to build up since the first half of 2018, but production expectations as a result of the weak economic environment and trade tensions and lower exports have continued to go down since the first half of 2018. On the left-hand side, in the lower section of the slide, you see the order, the picture for orders in relation to major steel using sectors. You can clearly see continued downward trend in the order of metal goods, while motor vehicles and mechanical engineering have continued to experience a decrease in orders since the start of 2019, but then have shown some sign of stabilization in recent months. These are the green and the red lines respectively. Whereas residential building orders have continued to be stable, so they have experienced no significant decline and have remained stable around the levels experienced in the latest years. So you can clearly see different situations, different pictures for the various steel using sectors, but we'll see a bit more in details in the subsequent slides. First, the construction sector has so far clearly been the best performing sectors among steel using industries. You see the construction confidence has stabilized somewhat and has shown some slowdown in recent months, but has remained around rather high levels in historical terms. The construction sector has continued to grow in output, primarily driven by a strong residential market, fueled by increasing residential demand, housing demand, particularly in some member states, which is, however, expected to slow down in the next months. On the other hand, the private non-residential construction, that is industrial, offices, and commercial buildings, have shown some weakness in recent quarters, being affected by the general weak business sentiment that has hampered considerably business investment. Despite despite interest rates at very record lows, which has had very little impact on investment decisions. On the other hand, civil engineering has really been the key driver for the growth of the construction sector, with continued growth over the last quarters, and it really remains the key subsector for construction, particularly in Eastern Europe. The output growth of construction sector in 2019 is expected to be 3.8%, more or less the same as in 2018, which was 4%. But as we will see, the outlook for 2020 and 2021 will show some slowdown, albeit remaining at at rather high growth rate, particularly for civil engineering, which will continue to benefit from ongoing public investment decisions and use of structural funds, particularly in Eastern countries, and also will be supported by improved public finances conditions in many member states. Residential construction, as I said earlier, will have a slowdown due to slowing demand, and private non-residential will continue to be affected by low business sentiment and the overall weak economic activity. And also supply constraints will remain an issue, particularly in some member states, that is to say labor shortage in the construction sector. So this will also contribute to easing construction activity. However, as an end result, output growth will remain around 1%, considerably lower than previous years, but still we will have growth, 0.8% both in 2020 and 2021. The automotive sector shows a quite different picture. The current situation for this year is primarily driven by weak export markets, weak manufacturing activity, business uncertainty mounting, particularly in the second half of this year. Interestingly, figures which became available very recently, in the whole 2019, car sales in the EU rose by 1.2% year on year, which was the result of a very low car sales in the first half of this year, but a rather strong rebound over the last 4 months, which resulted into positive growth. But in terms of output, output has been falling considerably in the last quarters, as I said, driven by business uncertainty, but also driven by some delays in improving new technologies, and particularly in gaining WLTP certification for some car manufacturers, which had a negative impact on their output and production planning. In the third quarter of 2019, output in the EU automotive sector, as a result, fell by 2.5% year-on-year, for an overall fall over the whole 2019 of almost 6%, which is the worst performance in output for the automotive sector since 2012. The outlook for the next 2 years is going to improve only moderately. We expect that in 2020 and 2021, we will see growing demand from consumers of electric vehicles. So the EV market is set to grow with consumer preferences shifting from conventional, let's say, petrol and diesel cars to electric vehicles. But however, the market penetration of electric vehicles will remain rather limited. So this will not offset the output loss in conventional cars, and also the loss in the decrease in sales will not be offset by the decrease in sales of electric vehicles. So in terms of domestic demand, this will continue to be rather weak. And also export markets will continue to provide almost negative contribution to growth in car sales, particularly in key export markets such as US, China, and Turkey. External demand will continue to be weak due to trade tensions and general macroeconomic uncertainty. The commercial vehicle market segment will also remain rather weak over the next 2 years. So as an end result, automotive output is expected to grow only by 1% in 2020, followed by a stronger recovery, almost 3% in 2021. The outlook for mechanical engineering looks pretty much the same as for automotive. This is also a largely export-oriented industrial sector, which is very, very sensitive to fluctuations in overall trade sentiment and in trade value, in worldwide trade activity. In 2019, mechanical engineering output has been affected by weak investment growth, depressed international trade, and subdued economic growth all over Europe and other sources of concern and uncertainty, which have impacted the sector significantly. And also, as we saw in the previous slide, the decline in orders is expected to continue to impact actual output in mechanical engineering in very short term in the subsequent quarters, and has increasingly led producers to delay their investment decisions due to overall uncertainty. Production activity in mechanical engineering has dropped by 1% year on year in the third quarter of 2019, and is set to drop by very moderately in the whole year 2019. So a moderate drop, but as I said, this is the result of negative growth rates in the last quarters. The outlook for the next 2 years is very much linked to possible improvements in the global trade environment. As we said, the sector being clearly exposed to fluctuations in trade, particularly for a country like Germany, which is largely export-oriented. However, the prospects are not very positive, given the current conditions and given the information which is available due to weak trade outlook and low business sentiment. So business conditions are expected to improve considerably only from second half of 2020, as for the automotive sector. And there will be some rebound in orders, which, however, will translate into new output and into additional output only gradually, and so we will have a lagged impact on actual output of mechanical engineering. On the other hand, the sector will benefit from cheap credit conditions and low interest rates, which will remain all across the EU in the next year. So as an end result, the output is expected to grow moderately by 0.6% in 2020 and 1.5% slightly higher growth in 2021. So we finally come to the steel market. These are some key indicators which are available in the full report, or we will try to summarize a bit the major trends. In a nutshell, apparent consumption has shown a clearly downward trend during 2019. Apparent consumption has been falling year on year since early 2019, reflecting a negative trend in real steel consumption and an unusual process of destocking, a decrease in stocks, which is a bit unusual, as the usual pattern, the seasonal pattern, sees increases in stocks over the first and second quarter of each year, whereas we've seen a decrease in stocks in the second half of this year, which is quite unusual, but it signals very, very low market expectations and rather hard market conditions. So as an end result, apparent consumption has continued to fall. The imports picture is quite interesting because overall EU imports from third countries has fallen by 11% year on year over the first 11 months of 2019 compared to the same period of 2018. But on the other hand, the import penetration has remained at very, very high levels, so that the import level has remained at quite high level in historical terms. This has been due to many factors, particularly the EU safeguards have contributed to limit import volumes to a certain extent, but have also led to more volatile monthly imports. If we look at the chart, which is in the lower section of the slide, we have a closer view to EU imports of finished products in monthly data of imports, and we clearly see an unusual peak in July with increasing volatility during 2019. At the same time, what we've seen is a clearly downward pressure on prices that has intensified in recent months, which is clearly has proven very detrimental to EU steel producers, because it has almost offset any gain in market share and has really hampered profits for EU steel makers due to this downward pressure on prices. And all in all, apparent consumption will decrease by 3.3% in 2019. The first annual drop since 2013, and this 3% drop follows an increase in 2.8% in 2018, which still benefited from the positive industrial cycle. So this is really a turnaround in this respect. The outlook for the next 2 years, the title which we've used is Technical Recovery, because what we expect is that basically there will be some improvement, as we saw in the major steel using sectors. So from the demand side, there will be some improvement as some steel using sectors will recover somewhat. But most importantly, there will be some stock rebuilding, which will gain some speed. And this will lead to a recovery, a rebound in apparent consumption, which will grow by 1.2% in 2020 and 2.3% in 2021. But this will be mainly due to restocking rather than a real increase in demand from steel using sectors. And also the current transfer mechanism of unused quota, so that the quota that hasn't been used on each quarter can be transferred, can be carried over to the next quarter, will most probably continue to benefit non-EU producers to the detriment of EU steel producers. So this will still continue to benefit imports. And as an end result, we expect that once steel demand will rebound substantially, exporters, third country which export to the EU, are likely to benefit more than the EU steel sector. And there are still, as we said, due to volatility in imports, there are still risks of import distortions with unusual import volumes and volatility, which clearly shows some destabilization in the supply-demand balance. In the next slide, we'll have a closer look at the breakdown of imports by country with an overview of major exporters to the EU up to Q3 2019 and up to November, indeed. In the first chart, you see the volumes, the pie chart, you see the volumes of imports by country of origin in the first 11 months of 2019, Turkey being the leading country, as in the previous quarters. The total imports of finished products into the EU, interestingly, in the first 11 months of 2019, decreased by 13%. But as I've said earlier, still remains very, very high in historical terms, and import penetration remains considerable. The first 5 countries, the first 5 importers, Turkey, Russia, South Korea, China, and India, together represent 65% of total finished steel imports into the EU from January to November 2019. Turkey actually holds 23% of overall imports to the EU. But in terms of individual countries, it is worth noting that Turkey, which is still the largest exporting country to the EU, Turkey has recorded a marginal decrease in the imports of finished products, in export of finished products to the EU, which is minus 0.7%, which is a marginal decrease, but it still signals some easing pressure in terms of imports from Turkey.
Sounds not working.
Compared to the first 11 months of 2018. While other major exporters to the EU, Brazil, India, Taiwan, and South Korea, all recorded steeper falls in exports to the EU. So we've seen some moderation in imports. However, if we have a closer look at some specific flat products, which is the other chart which is available, we see that imports level from Turkey, from the largest exporting country to the EU, imports level of some flat products have doubled in 2019, in the first 11 months, compared to what we call the reference period, which is the average from 2015 to 2017, which is the reference period. So, for example, hot rolled coil imports are twice as much in volume as they were in 2018, and also imports for other flat products such as cold rolled sheet and metal coated sheet, albeit at much lower volumes in absolute terms, have continued to increase in 2019. So for flat products, the picture is more challenging to a certain extent. Turkey remaining the larger exporter and still exporting at very high levels. The next slide is a snapshot which tries to recap and summarize the current challenges, the current downturn of the steel industry in Europe. So this chart reports the overall production cuts in 2019 as a result of depressed demand and imports pressure and lower business expectations due to the deterioration of the business environment. Very simply, with the crossed dots, you can see the plants across Europe that have individually decided to reduce their production in 2019 for a total of 8 million tons in 2019. And with the red dots and the green dots, you see the steel plants that have permanently shut down their capacity, and so they have closed permanently since the first industrial and economic crisis of 2009, for a total capacity reduction overall in all these years of 15 million tons. So this is this gives an idea of the magnitude of the crisis, the magnitude of the challenges that the steel industry is facing. So briefly to conclude and to recap what we've seen so far, the economic outlook continues to be quite uncertain, suffering from uncertainty and major concerns stemming from international trade, Brexit-related uncertainty, also possibly some recent tensions at the geopolitical level in the Middle East, and also concerns which may spread from the recent coronavirus, particularly for China. And economic growth will therefore remain in Europe as well as the global level. At the world level, will remain below 3%, which is also something unusual. So growth will remain below trend in Europe, driven, as I said, primarily by private consumption and services rather than by imports. Manufacturing activity will continue to be weak due to slowing investment, stagnation in trade. The cycle will improve from second half of 2020. Construction will remain the best positioned sector with stronger performance also over the 2020-2021 period. Although it will also slow down, but the sector will primarily benefit from the fact that it's not being exposed to fluctuation in international trade and less exposed to competition. By contrast, automotive and mechanical engineering will continue to be weak and to record slow growth in output in 2020 and 2021. The sharp decline in apparent steel consumption in the first half of 2019 and the continued drop in the second half of 2019 will result in a fall of 3.3% over the whole 2019. Imports have shown some moderation in the first 11 months of 2019, but still remain at very, very high levels. And we see increasingly downward pressure on prices, which is very detrimental to EU steel producers. We expect a technical recovery in EU steel demand in 2020, which is primarily due to stock building rather than substantial recovery in demand from steel using sectors. And still there is a growing risk that once demand will rebound, steel demand will rebound in the EU, this will mostly benefit exporting countries to the EU rather than domestic EU steel producers, and due to the transfer mechanism of unused quota, according to the safeguard measures. Thank you very much for your attention. This is all, and Carl, I think the floor is yours.
Yes, I continue.
We'll do questions at the end. So.
Okay. Okay, yes, good morning. I would like to go a bit more at the global level first, and then to touch on some trade topics and even some trade policy topics, which are of direct concern and interest for our sector. So, about the global steel market, just to give you the bigger picture, which is worrying because we are seeing a squeeze on the one hand, the global steel capacity, which after a change in the growing trend in 2016, 17, 18, where we have seen after a long time, driven by China, a a small reduction capacity. Unfortunately, 2019, we see a renewal of an increase of capacity. In relation to production, it also has led in 2019 to increase in excess capacity. And of course, China is driving this global change in the trend, as it is now even more than 50% of representing the global steel industry capacity-wise and also production. A squeeze because, at the other hand, in terms of global steel demand, this is the forecast of World Steel. There we see for this year, 2020, a significant weakening of the demand. Demand still remaining positive, but much weaker than the demand, almost 4% last year. And this is a global or an aggregated view of the demand forecast, but there is a significant difference among the economies. And the developed economies already last year were stagnating, the demand was stagnating, and there is not a significant change to be expected for this year. So this is the squeeze at the global level, which creates or will create further tensions. On trade, let me update you on the Section 232, first of all. So the American import tariff, which was adopted in the mid of 2018. This policy has also, like trade, a lot of volatility. Trump trade policy is volatile. Countries have been exempted for different reasons, in particular Canada and Mexico. We have seen in 2019 suddenly that Turkey received a doubling of the 25 import tariff that has in the meantime been returned back to 25. But overall, there is this 25% import tariff, which, and this is of course the key, looking to the US steel import statistics, appear to function for the purpose it was designed. The purpose of the Section 232 was to structurally reduce steel imports in the US in order to revitalize the US steel industry. And the way to achieve this was simply to shift volumes traditionally from imports to shift it to the domestic producers. The objective is up to 13% of a structural reduction in US imports. And this is accumulated assessment monthly of showing the reduction in imports. So the Section 232 is is evolving or is creating the change in import volumes quite effectively. It means that the Section 232 is working. That also most likely means that there is no reason for the US administration industry to stop this measure. We have added also an additional view in terms of the statistics of US steel imports, where we just show on the left side, this is the evolution of the EU steel imports into the US compared to the imports from other sources combined, where you see that in the first year, in fact, EU exports to the US did not suffer really. We did not really lose volume in the US market, but it has changed dramatically in April, May last year. And that has to do with the change in the US steel market, which at the start of the Section 232 basically experienced an explosion in the US domestic prices. at price levels where even the 25% was paid by US importers, users in particular, for products which are long-term traditional quality products from the EU. But the price has also come down in 2019 in the US market, and that has clearly started to impact our business in the US. Now for the US, the point here is that, of course, prices continue to change. The cyclicality is not neutralized by the Section 232. So there are demand evolutions, there are price movements, but the Section 232 helps to ensure that the US domestic price in its own volatility remains higher than international prices, and in particular, the EU price. And so it's the relative, it's a difference in the regional price levels where basically the protection comes from. And if you have this price differentiation to the benefit of the US domestic price, you could say that the Section 232 is a subsidy given by government without government having to pay anything. In fact, they even get money out of it. Then looking to the EU market, and this is just basically repeating what Alessandro just mentioned, the European steel imports went down indeed in 2019. But, and these are done for flat and long, you have done the graphs at the right side. These are the percentage import market share, but the import pressure in terms of market share has not come down. This one I've seen. Yeah, the safeguard. We had in October last year a review, a change in safeguard modalities. As you may remember or know, this is a tariff rate quota applicable to a whole range of flat and long steel products, based on traditional import flows, which was basically the Commission looking to 2015, 2017 average. So there has been a first review, which led to some changes in the safeguard modalities and quota level, which was adopted in October last year. What the Commission there changed was, first of all, a reduction in the increase of the quotas. As you may know, the WTO imposes the obligation that a safeguard measure throughout the running period has to gradually be relaxed. If you have a quota relaxation, then logically means that you increase the quota, the tariff-free quota. Now, the increase was originally set at 5%. In the review of October, the Commission slightly reduced this because we already convinced the Commission that the quota increase was out of pace with the reality of the market, which was the reduction and the difficulty experienced in 2019 in the European market in particular, as explained by Alessandro. So there was a small reduction. But there were also some other changes. I don't want to go too much in the technical details, but there was also a change which reflects a concern not just of the level of the volumes of the quota, but also in terms of the management of the quota. And the experience showed that some exporting countries have been eating up, if I may say, their quota in an irrational way by consuming the quota applicable for a period even in a couple of weeks, which is, of course, technically the volumes are still within the quota, nothing wrong, but in reality the market has been distorted, and we saw this at the beginning of last year for hot rolled flat. Turkey, who suddenly in 1 month brought more than 500,000 tons back, which created a shock in the market, in the hot rolled flat market. At the time, we needed to increase our prices, reflecting the increase in raw materials, iron ore in particular. So we were cut off from that because of this over concentration of this massive import volume coming from one country. On top of that, there was also Russia. So you had there a combination of a major distortion at the critical moment of the market of the year, which is the beginning of the year. So that was all analyzed. It was acknowledged by the Commission, and the Commission introduced in October also another change, which was to limit the use of the quota for key exporters to only 30% of the volume, to avoid that one or two could take the whole quota or a major part of the quota, which was then also was pushing out other exporters who complained to the Commission and said, yes, but Turkey is taking the volume, and where am I? Moreover, Turkey is a neighbor country, so logistically they were absolutely well organized to prepare volumes and to bring it in Europe at high speed. There is now a need for another review because markets change. The situation has not improved, on the contrary. And there are mechanisms now where we see that they continue to create problems. Problems in terms of the function of the safeguard. The safeguard is there to avoid market disruption and injury to our industry in the European market because of deflection of volumes from the US directly and indirectly to our market. There is a mechanism, Alessandro mentioned that briefly, there is a mechanism of quotas, yearly quotas, where per quarter unused are transferred to the next quarter. Now, for a product like hot rolled flat, which are quarterly quotas, 2 million tons, 2.1 per quarter, we have seen that already from the quarter, and I'll take here the numbers, from July, July to end of September, there has been about 580,000 tons not used, reflecting the depressed demand in Europe. This is now shifted on the quota of October, December of 2019. There is going to be another 600,000–700,000 tons not used there. This will be again shifted on the quota, which is the current quota of January, March, and this goes on and goes on. So you come to the point where you have an inflation of quota volumes which are absolutely out of touch with the reality of the market. Now you could say, well, what's the problem? If imports are, if quotas are not used, that means that the imports are low, and they are low in terms of volume because indeed the demand is problematic, remains problematic. But again, first of all, the volumes are down, but the import share is not down. And secondly, of course, we do expect an improvement in demand. We also expect some improvement in prices. Hot rolled flat prices are gradually starting to improve. So we do expect technical correction, restocking, some improvement of price, which means that the European market will and is becoming more attractive. If imports are more attracted towards the EU market at the time that the quota has been, and our estimation is it will be increased by 70%, is going to create a problem, and again questions the capacity of the safeguard to avoid market disruption and injury to industry because of the volumes coming back massively to the EU attracted by better market condition. So this means that we need a new review, and we need to review urgently. As we know, review always takes time. It goes through a procedure. But we need to have some further stabilization modalities in the quota system. We are looking into this at this very moment, but we cannot wait till July, August, September. The thing will play between now and end of spring. Another topic, just for your information, this is about trade actions. We just want to mention that the Commission has initiated WTO action recently, I think it was in December, against Indonesia. And Indonesia for stainless steel, it's a quite specific situation. Chinese investment in Indonesia is building up massive capacities for export. The volumes of the capacity are totally unrelated to what Indonesia, which is an emerging economy and indeed has a growth in demand, but it is totally unrelated compared to what Indonesia means. So that is for export. This is based on subsidization, also from China into Indonesia, but also Indonesia is helping the development of these excess capacities domestically by ensuring that these capacities benefit from preferential access to the key raw material of stainless, which is nickel. So there is a ban on nickel export. Indonesia is a major producer and exporter of this. So this is a classical protectionist measure in steel at the level of raw materials. Raw materials are 50 to 60% of the cost of production. So if a government provides an artificial benefit to the raw material for the domestic steel industry, you have a major distortion. So we welcome this action. This is clearly against WTO. The Commission has initiated this, and of course we support this, and we're looking forward to a positive outcome. At the same time, in parallel, the Commission also initiated the anti-dumping and subsidy investigations recently on hot rolled flat stainless. Several countries, I think China is there, Indonesia is there. And that's a parallel action. The Global Forum on Excess Capacity, this initiative, multilateral, high-level G20 forum, finished its work or its mandate in December last year, a 3-year period. So you may remember, I think we talked about at some previous conferences. The forum looks into basically 2 things. First, to create transparency on the steel market conditions and on the capacity development evolution. And second, it looks into the way, the extent and the way governments contribute in their policies and subsidization, basically. They contribute to the capacity issue, the global excess capacity issue, which is the root cause of the problems of our industries worldwide and also and regionally. So after 3 years of work, which led to a lot of insights into the 2 topics, transparency, government intervention, had to be renewed in December. That was the intention. The renewal of the forum mandate has been agreed, except for China, which leads to the situation where you have half of the steel industry who has pulled out of the work. The reasons we understand China is, look, we have done a lot already in capacity reduction. It is true, China has reduced a lot, in particular cleaning up the obsolete part of the industry, but the excess capacity is still there and it is still growing based on replacement of capacity state of the art and most critically with the continuation of subsidization. So China is out, but the forum continues. EUROFER has been in contact with other steel associations, 19 regional steel associations, where we in December called upon the continuation of the forum, and notwithstanding China, the forum will continue as this is a long-term work, which is very important to have governments fully understanding what's going on in our sector and the root causes of the problem we are facing. Another topic of policy is the recent statement of the US, China, and Japan. And this is also in the context of WTO. where for the first time we have seen substantive proposal to strengthen disciplines on subsidization. As I mentioned in the Global Forum, subsidization is the root cause of distortions, capacity distortions, and the WTO subsidy rules do not allow to capture disciplines. And so EU, US, Japan has been working on a template to improve and strengthen disciplines. You have here a list of the types of subsidies which have been now brought into this template. This is fundamental step forward because, of course, we know the tensions of US unilateral trade policies, creating irritation also not just with China but also with trade partners like Japan and the EU. So notwithstanding this very problematic situation on this very specific topic critical for steel, there is clearly a cooperation and it is a condition that the three economies drive and take leadership, because at some point this template will have to be expanded to the economies which matter most for this problem, which is in particular China, but then you have Indonesia, you have other emerging economies who are who tends to provide subsidies and government support precisely because they are developing their own domestic industry, while we are basically restructuring. And just one word on that, the EU in this volatile, difficult, conflictual context of trade policies, China, or US against China in particular, the EU is looking also into what unilaterally could do more to what is called enforce our rights. We have WTO rules, but there are also a lot of FTAs with additional rules, additional disciplines above WTO, concluded by the EU with its trade partners. Often, certain commitments by third countries are not respected. Raw material, export restrictions, subsidization. And there is now an initiative to strengthen the Commission's capacity, the EU capacity, to act more quickly against infringement of third country commitments, trade commitments, be it under the WTO commitment or the bilateral FTAs, in particular where a dispute settlement mechanism, if it is foreseen, is blocked. As you may know, WTO appeal body is blocked, the dispute settlement is blocked. So there is a clear engagement from the Commission in particular to strengthen its own capacity to react even up to retaliation and compensation if necessary. So I'll stop here and Charles, give you back the floor.
Thank you very much, Carl, Alessandro, Jerome. I'm going to put questions first from the floor here, if there are any here, and then we'll go to anyone who wants to ask questions on the chat. So I've opened the floor here for any questions. Poppy, of course.
Good morning. Thanks very much for the presentation. I'm Poppy Carnell from MLEX. My question is more tradey, so Carl and the spotlight here. I have two questions, if that's okay. The first one is regarding your comments on the need for a review of the safeguard. You've hinted at actually the problem being the quota, but do you have a specific message on what you want to happen? Does that mean that you want to cancel the rule that they can carry over the quota? Is that simply what you're asking for, or is there more that you're asking for the safeguard? And the second question I had is, it was mentioned about the imports in general are decreasing, but for the Ukraine they were actually increasing. And I just wanted to know if did I understand that correctly?
No, I think let's go to this. I think this slide, at least as far as
the only exception
my
is
part.
imports from the Ukraine, which recorded a double-digit increase. on page 20. I think you mentioned it actually. Or did I? Am I imagining it? It's
Yeah,
written here.
that's true. That's true.
Okay. Well, my question was going to be what the reason was for an increase in the Ukraine. Is this could this be a dumping
That's true.
concern? But I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
On the first question, well, this is exactly what we are looking at now very, very deeply, because we are saying that the time is of essence, so we better should be clear also in what we would like to see or what we would need in order to come to a better functioning of the safeguard. First of all, I think it has to be seen on a product-specific level. I mentioned twice hot rolled flat, but there are other products, and the situation is not always the same as hot rolled flat. So hot rolled flat is a critical situation. So that will for sure will be a first priority. It's logic also because the hot rolled flat product is the major cost factor of cold rolled and coating, the downstream products. So it is the mother product, let's say, of the total integrated flat steel industry. Yeah, what do we want? I think there are two things. As I mentioned, there is first of all the level of the quota, and then there is the management, the modalities. I would even say the distribution of the quota. And we see a need to have a review looking into both aspects. In terms of the volume, it's clear they are way too high. But okay, what can be done? Because we know that the WTO obliged to relax them. So we are already in the second safeguard year. Over time, there'll be relaxation. There was a relaxation from 5% down to 3%. Is there going to be a lot of room there to go further down? Probably not. So you could say from 3 to 2%, okay, EUROFER, voila, you have a bit less quota here, but this 1% would be more cosmetic than substantial. We think that the Commission could look back in what they decided in February. In February, when they imposed the final measures, they adopted the 5% increase, relaxation. But at the same time, they also increased with another 5% the quota for user interest reasons, as it is called, to give room for imports, to avoid the risk of shortage somewhere, so to be flexible with regard to imports and import supply of the market. But this was in a scenario where we're still perceived to see further increase. We know in 2019 that the opposite happened. So this 5%, I think, could and should be reconsidered because the situation of the market has evolved in opposite to what was the expectation then, which was in February 2019, but based on an analysis of 4 or 5 months before that. So this 5%, which is not a relaxation part, this could be reconsidered and would effectively lead to some adjustment in the quota levels, reflecting in the reality of our market. On the other aspect of the modality of the quota or the distribution of the quota, you have the carryover. Yes, the carryover should be eliminated. It doesn't make any sense. It inflates the volumes and it is going to create a massive open door when imports will come back. Third, there is a 30% cap on the hot rolled flat quota for certain countries. So they are listed And these are the major ones. We know them. It's Russia, it's Turkey, it's also Serbia. You also have a 30% on the residual quota of rebar and wire rod, the same mechanism. So the 30% for 5-6 countries is 180%, which is way 80% above. If they all use it, it's way too high compared to the volume. And so the 30% we think could or should be reduced. Now, 20% would basically, if we expect that in an improved market situation, imports coming back into Europe, that it will be Turkey, Russia, Serbia, India, there will be 3 exporting countries who would be the first to use the 30%, plus some others, smaller. And that is, with the 30% would lead to another surge and disruption of the market. So this 30% could be reduced, for example, down to 20% and would lead, we are looking into this, we need to make simulations, we need to have the numbers correctly in front of you, but just very roughly thinking a reduction down to 20% could have a stabilizing effect.
Do you know yet whether this 30% is being used by these countries? Are they going up to their limits?
No, for the moment it's not used. It's also a question of anticipation. Often we see that measures are taken but too late. If the imports remain low for the next 2 years, fine. But again, it's not just about the volumes, it's also about the market share over it. That's fine. However, as Alessandro mentioned, there is going to be a restocking. There's going to be more demand from stock building, which is a correction, and prices in Europe are slightly increasing. So the combination will almost certainly lead to more import because our market is becoming more attractive again. Now we know how quickly trade volumes can shift, and in this case, shift back to the EU. And so then you have to look to the numbers, and our first impression is that if this scenario will materialize, the 30% will create problems. And we know where the volumes will come from, and they tend to come from neighbor countries who can act very quickly logistically. So these are, let's say, orientations. On Ukraine, I don't know what you can say there. Ukraine is not in the hot rolled flat business because of the dumping duty. So if they increase their imports into the EU, it must be from other products.
I remember by heart, but I guess so. Yeah.
Perhaps plate.
Yeah.
And plate typical Ukraine is a plate. So that could be there an increase. But you know how we work on these things. We just monitor on an ongoing basis for each of the products the import trends per country, per exported country. And we look whether there are conditions of dumping or not, and whether there is injury if there is dumping on our sector for the product concerned. So we cannot say more on that. Yeah.
Any questions immediately here?
I had some questions. First question regarding the safeguard. I know that the EUROFER safeguard is set up based on the European import during the year 2015 to 2017, right? But as Turkey, you mentioned that this is a very significant case. I suggest that because safeguard is the target for the Section 232, maybe we should analyze the U.S. import source during the 2015 to 2017, because the Section 232 make the country shift the import to U.S. to Europe. So I wonder maybe that could be a target for us to set up the safeguard? For example, Turkey is the example.
But I think this has been done and is being done. Because indeed, the trigger of the steel safeguard is the Section 232. There's a direct connection. If you see, going back to these graphs, these are the US, and of course, this is not per exporting country. You would need to go into the details of this graph. But and we have simulations of that, but not simulations. You compare trade statistics and you see correlations there. And it is clear that the deflection is there. And it is Turkey, but it's not just Turkey, of course. It is also Russia. I mean, the US market has traditionally been by far the biggest net steel importing market in the world. So, and this, we talk here about 25, even excluding semis, 20, up to 30 million tons. So if these volumes are now going to be reduced structurally from 30 to 20 million tons, that's 10 million tons. So this deflection is a reality. What has a bit sheltered us last year is simply that even all the volumes available to shift from one location to another, the European market was been so bad that also the volumes in Europe went down. Not the market share, but the volume went down. But these are volumes who are still looking for opportunities to be placed outside the domestic market. And this is Turkey. We know that the Turkish economy went into a depression. When was it already? In mid-19.
Yeah.
You have the lira depreciation, which basically stimulates conditions for export. So the obstacle in the US, combined with the Turkish economic depression, immediately exposing massive excess capacity, is clearly causing a deflection. So we can. We can demonstrate this just by looking to the statistics. So I don't think we need to do their additional effort to support our requests for a new review on the safeguard. We think that the Commission acknowledged that the Section 232 is really creates a deflection risk, and that the condition. This is why I also mentioned the situation of the Section 232, because Section 232 is working, the deflection risk remains. And we expect the Section 232 to continue for the time being. There is no indication where suddenly Trump would stop this. It's working.
And also last Friday, Trump announced that would like to extend this Section 232. So is there any plan to update the safeguard? Is there any regular plan in the near future?
These are products, not basic. These are first transformation of basic steel products. So we represent the basic steel producers, while the expansion, as I understand, is for primary transformed products. Already in the category of primary transformed products, the tubes, they are already in the safeguard from the start. This is about nails and I don't know what, I'm not sure even I understand it, what type of products it is, but these are smaller niche products, which I would expect is an expansion, of course. Certain industries will be impacted, but they are outside the scope of EUROFER, so I cannot say much about it. It's not for us to expand, to ask for an expansion of the safeguard, covering that downstream group of products.
You see already some things are changing. That Steel in the Netherlands was actually tariffs were lifted for battery steel. So you see the impact. Products that are not being able to be sourced internally in the US market. Unfortunately, they depend on European imports. They see at least the first signs of they're coming to the conclusion that they're hampering their domestic industry, the battery producers. So I don't know whether more exemptions will follow, but that has been the first lifting of tariffs for one specific product from one specific supplier in Europe. That happened very recently.
I have a second question. Because last year in the December, there is a new policy in Europe for the Green Deal. So I wonder, can you tell us what's the difference between Green Deal and safeguard? Will be there the double tax on the import products? Is it available?
Well, I think if I may, there's another question related to this. You're referring to the carbon border tax adjustment, the CBA, rather than Green Deal per se. That's a much larger file. The CBA is a smaller part of that. So the carbon border adjustment is a legitimate question, which we've also had here. I don't know if you want to react on that.
Carbon border adjustment is, unlike safeguard, is not a trade measure. It's not a trade policy measure. It very likely will take the form of what we call a trade measure, but it is not a trade. It's not part of trade policy. It's part of climate change policy. It's fundamental difference. So you need to make a distinction. The objectives are totally different. The concern of safeguard is to stabilize, to avoid disruption of market, a domestic market, because there is an exceptional situation crisis in the market. For example, the Section 232 in steel was triggered such an exceptional, safeguard is an exceptional trade measure, and it has a trade policy objective. Carbon adjustment is about carbon leakage. And carbon leakage is a situation where, because of the unilateral climate change objective defined by the EU on its own industry, including energy and other sources of CO2 emission, looks to avoid that by pursuing, in our case, ambitious climate change objectives, so ambitious CO2 reduction, that energy intensive, because this is where the CO2 problem is situated mostly, that energy intensive industries like steel, cement, chemicals would become uncompetitive globally. In particular, industries which are energy intensive but which are under international competition through trade mainly. And so that question relates to how to ensure that we achieve our ambitious climate objective in Europe without facing the consequence that industry leaves Europe. All the energy intensive industries. And that is a different discussion, that's a different objective, and that is a complicated question, of course, because it is related to climate change objectives where the EU is taking leadership, but of course will face the challenge to see that its trade partners, other economies follow. But this is then about the Paris Agreement, and that is separate from trade policy considerations.
Any other questions here?
Excuse me, I have
A
a third
fourth
question.
question.
Sorry. Thanks for your time. My third question is that regarding the global steel capacity that EUROFER, you set up some platform with the US, Asia. So for another topic, for the global decarbonization, because I noticed that last year the CEO of Salzgitter had a personal interview, and he mentioned that because the steel industry in Europe is not going very well, and there are still players really have great pressure to develop the decarbonization technology. So I wonder, does Europe have some plan also to set up some global decarbonization funding with other countries? I mean,
Well, I mean, we are industry, yeah. We are not government.
Yeah.
We first of all look to our own governments and decision makers, which is basically the EU institutions, including also the member states, of course. Decarbonization and the ambition of -30 and by 2030 and -80, 90, or even the total decarbonization by 2050 will need breakthrough technology. Companies like Salzgitter and others are very hard working on developing pilot projects in the plants, hydrogen, carbon capture, to significantly reduce the CO2 emission in order to be able to comply with these objectives, -30 respectively, -80 and 90%. So there is, of course, also an opportunity to become leader in the technologies to decarbonize. So that is important. Our other steel companies outside Europe taking the same efforts? I don't know. But because Europe is front-runner in the climate change objectives, our industry have to lead this, have to follow, have to achieve the CO2 reduction levels, which are basically imposed by our own regulators. So the first mover can give us an advantage, but of course we have to be able to materialize this. And we talk about billions of investment, and therefore there needs to be the right framework in Europe to allow that we remain competitive. After all, we are on a constant pressure from imports and third country distortions in steel. But we need time, and we need the support to achieve the technological changes and breakthrough technology even to achieve the objectives of the EU climate change reductions. So I cannot say more about this, but this is a key question which is now currently being discussed also with the policymakers, the decision makers, to try to ensure that there is the right package and I would say the framework of support, border adjustment, carbon border adjustment, into a rather tight framework. 2030 is not far away.
Anybody else? If not, I think we've reached the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for attending this seminar. I wish you all the best.
Just to clarify, is this all on record? Is this all quotable?
Yeah. The report will be probably
Publicly available.
distributed during this afternoon. Yeah, will be on our website.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah.